I transmigrated into a business romance as the cold wife villain. Chapter 20 was the day my CEO husband divorced me in front of his board. I moved my shares on day 3. The novel had written my role with the economy of a story that finds its obstacles less interesting than its central couple. I was cold, I was in the way, and I lost. Chapter 20 was the board meeting. Marcus at the head of his own conference table, announcing the divorce to 12 witnesses, because he was the kind of man who performed his decisions in front of an audience. In the novel's version, I had nothing when that moment came. No independent assets, no allies, no plan. I arrived with one advantage nobody in the story could have accounted for. I had read all 40 chapters before I lived a single page. Day 3, before Marcus had even met Claire for the first time, I started moving. By chapter 15, I had a financial position, a working relationship with the company's CFO, and a very clear understanding of what chapter 20 was going to mean for me. Not an ending, a starting line. My name was Nola. I arrived in the middle of a Tuesday morning, in a body sitting at a glass desk in a home office with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of organized silence that belongs to rooms where work has been done for a long time by someone who takes the work seriously. I had one clear thought, the specific thought that arrives when you recognize the scenery before anyone has told you where you are, and then the novel came back to me in full. I had read it on a long-haul flight, bought at the departure gate, because I had forgotten to download anything, and the alternative was the in-flight magazine. It was not a bad novel. It was competent and emotionally coherent, and it had the kind of warm female lead who makes you genuinely want things to work out for her. I had finished it somewhere over the Atlantic and set it in the seat pocket and thought, briefly, that someone should have given the cold wife one chapter of her own. Just one. To ask why she was cold. I was now that cold wife. I had 3 days before Marcus met Claire at the Harrison Foundation Charity Gala. Day 3, Chapter 5, the inciting event of the novel's central romance. I had 2 hours before Marcus came home from the office for lunch, which he did on Tuesdays because the office building's food options were poor and Nola's kitchen was not. I had a prenup in the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet under legal, marital, sorted by date, and I had the specific memory of having read it on a flight home from nowhere in particular and noticing a gap that the author had included without understanding what it meant. I went to the filing cabinet first. Let me tell you what the novel had given me to work with and what it had assumed I would not notice. The prenup was 17 pages. Marcus's legal team had been thorough in the areas that mattered to them. The company's shares he held at the time of marriage were ring-fenced, clearly and completely. The intellectual property of the firm was ring-fenced. The family trust from his parents was ring-fenced with 3 separate clauses, which suggested either that his parents had been very specific in their instructions or that their lawyer had charged by the clause. 17 categories of marital asset had been addressed, defined, and allocated with the precision of people who had done this before and expected to need to refer back to the document later. There was an 18th category they had not addressed. A block of company equity, structured in year 1 of the marriage as a personal gift from Marcus to Nola, registered legally as a gift rather than a joint holding because that was how his financial team had framed it at the time, sat in a gap the prenup had not spoken to. It was possible Marcus's legal team had considered the gift too small at the time of the prenup to warrant specific attention. The gift had not been small. And 3 years of the company's growth, during which the company's valuation had increased significantly, had made it considerably less small than it had been. The gift was mine. Without qualification, without encumbrance, without any legal mechanism for Marcus to reclaim it or dispute its ownership. I just needed to move it to an independently controlled account before anyone on Marcus's team thought to revisit the prenup's gaps. I had 2 days to begin the process before Day 3's gala, and a financial advisor to engage before I could do anything official. The transfer itself would not be complicated once it was initiated. It was simply a matter of moving an asset from a jointly held account that was, technically, solely in Nola's name, to an independently controlled account that was unambiguously solely in Nola's name. The complication was the window. The longer the share package sat in its current position, the more likely that someone on Marcus's legal team would review the prenup for a second time and identify the gap. Prenup reviews happen in the context of disputes. Disputes were initiated by one party deciding to end the marriage. I did not know exactly when Marcus would make that decision in real time. I knew Chapter 20 was the board meeting, but I did not know precisely when he had privately resolved on it. What I knew was that the resolution would accelerate after the gala, and that the acceleration would include, at some point, a conversation with his legal team, and that the conversation with his legal team would include a prenup review. I had 19 chapters, and I intended to be well clear of the gap before his legal team found it. I had 2 days to begin the process before Day 3's gala, and a financial advisor to engage before I could do anything official. The CFO of Marcus's company was a man named Dean Hartwell. The novel had introduced him in Chapter 8 and used him consistently as background. A competent presence at board meetings, reliable in crisis, loyal to the company in the specific way of someone who had served 3 different CEOs across 15 years and survived every leadership transition by making himself indispensable to the role rather than to any specific person in it. He was not a Marcus loyalist. He was a company loyalist. He had an instinct for competence that operated independently of the organizational hierarchy, and the novel had noted, in a single sentence in Chapter 11 that the author clearly considered minor, that at a board dinner in year 2, Dean had watched Nola identify a market position that the company's own analysts had missed, and had looked at her across the table with the expression of a man revising something. He had not said anything at the time. The novel had not returned to the moment. But the revision had happened, and revisions in people like Dean do not unhappen. I needed to give him a formal reason to act on it. And then there was Claire. Claire Marsh, the novel's female lead, junior financial analyst at Marcus's company, 31 years old, warm in a way that the novel kept returning to because it was the most important thing about her for the story's purposes. The novel had been honest about Claire in a way I found respectable. She was not scheming. She was not pursuing. She had not identified Marcus as a target or engineered their proximity. She was a competent professional who had been placed, by the accident of employment and the coincidence of the Harrison Foundation Gala's seating arrangements, in the right place at the right moment for Marcus to discover that warmth was something he had been missing and that it was possible to find. She had not caused the marriage's failure. The marriage had failed, quietly and without drama, long before she arrived. She was simply the person who happened to be present when Marcus noticed. I had no interest in fighting Claire. That was not where the problem was. The problem was structural. The original Nola had lost Chapter 20 not because she lacked resources, but because every resource she had was routed through Marcus. Her financial advisor had been introduced to her by Marcus's investment banker. Her lawyer was the family attorney who had also handled Marcus's real estate transactions. Her social network was composed almost entirely of people who had met her through Marcus's professional world and who, in the event of a contested divorce, would have reasons of their own to stay adjacent to the party most likely to remain useful. The original Nola had spent 3 years building a life that was entirely dependent on a marriage she was about to lose, and she had done this not because she was naive, but because the structure of the CEO's wife role had organized itself around that dependency, without her specifically choosing it. I arrived knowing this. I arrived with 3 days and a prenup with a gap in it, and a CFO who had once revised his opinion of someone he was not supposed to notice. I intended to use all of it. One more thing the novel had given me that most transmigration protagonists would not have thought to read carefully: the company's financial footnotes. The business romance had included, in its Chapter 9 board meeting scene, a brief reference to a joint venture Marcus had been evaluating with a Singapore-based infrastructure firm. The novel had not found this interesting enough to develop. It was background texture, a detail to make the corporate setting feel populated. But I had read it and I had retained it, and I knew that by Chapter 22 the venture would be approved and would produce, for the company's investors, a return that the broader market had not predicted because the regulatory approval the deal depended on had not been considered likely by most analysts. I was not most analysts. I had read Chapter 22. The investment firm Dean would eventually introduce me to had a position in the relevant sector. That position would look, to anyone examining it from the outside, like a confident and well-researched bet on a regulatory outcome that many people were skeptical of. From the inside, it was simply the application of information I had read in a business romance novel at 30,000 feet to a financial instrument that would reward that information correctly. I intended to use all of it. Let me tell you what 3 years of being Marcus's wife had actually been, before I tell you what I did with the 3 days that remained. The marriage had not been a love match. It had not been a cold transaction either, exactly. It had been the arrangement that two pragmatic and capable people sometimes arrive at when their circumstances align in the right configuration. Marcus needed a partner who understood corporate life well enough not to be a liability in it, who would manage the household and the social obligations with competence, and who would not require the sustained emotional investment that he had at 29, not had the bandwidth to provide. Nola had her own reasons for accepting, which the novel had treated as background, and which I will not speculate on because they were hers. What the arrangement had not produced was warmth. And the absence of warmth, over 3 years, accumulates. Marcus was charming at events. This was genuine rather than performed. He had grown up in rooms where social fluency was a professional skill, and he had developed it the way anyone develops a skill they use daily. At dinners, at galas, at the client hospitality events that kept relationships warm between formal business interactions, he was present, engaged, and specifically good at making people feel that their company was valued. He was the kind of person rooms organized themselves around. With Nola at home, he was transactional. Not unkind. Transactional. He discussed the week's schedule, the upcoming commitments, the dinner party she was organizing for his mentor's retirement, the renovation project in the second guest room that she was managing because he did not have the time. He listened to what she said with the attention of someone sorting incoming information for relevance, processing the actionable, releasing the rest. He thanked her for things when they were completed, specifically and correctly, which was more than some people manage, and less than others. She had learned to operate in the same register. You do not continue reaching for warmth from someone who responds to warmth with efficiency. You adapt. You become operational, because operational is what the situation rewards. And then the story you're living in calls you cold because the story can see that you have stopped reaching but cannot see when or why you stopped. She had not always been cold. The memory of this was in the body I had arrived in, distributed in small places. A recipe clipped from a magazine that Marcus had mentioned he liked, filed in the kitchen drawer and never made because the dinner never happened. An anniversary dinner reservation at the restaurant where they had announced their engagement, canceled the day before because a board call ran long. A note in the household calendar from year 1 marked with a question mark next to an event Marcus had said he might be home for, which he had not been home for, which she had stopped noting as a question mark. These were not evidence of cruelty. They were evidence of a specific kind of inattention, the inattention of someone who was not cruel but was consistently more interested in what was happening at the office than in what was happening at home, and who had structured his home to require the minimum necessary personal investment, and who had found, in Nola, a person capable of supplying that minimum so reliably that the minimum became the arrangement. You do not resent an arrangement for being an arrangement. You simply stop being surprised by it. And when you stop being surprised by it, you stop reaching beyond it. And when you stop reaching beyond it, the story you're living in calls you cold. She had not always been cold. The memory of this was in the body I had arrived in, distributed in small places. The recipe clipped from a magazine that Marcus had mentioned once, that he liked, filed in the kitchen drawer 2 years ago. The anniversary dinner reservation made at the restaurant where they had had their first meal as an officially announced couple, which Marcus had canceled the day before, citing a board call that ran long. The way she had learned, over time, to stop making reservations. The work she had done was real, and it was skilled, and the novel had treated it as scenery. The Harrison Foundation, which Marcus's company supported as its primary philanthropic partner, had been in administrative disarray when Nola began engaging with its board in year 1. She had spent 14 months on its restructuring, attending board meetings, identifying the specific operational failures that were producing funding inefficiencies, drafting the governance framework that the foundation now operated under. This was not part of her role as Marcus's wife. It was not part of anyone's role. She had done it because she had noticed a problem and had the skills to address it and had not, at that point in the marriage, run out of places to direct her energy. The foundation's executive director had sent her a letter, formal and gracious, thanking her for the work. The letter was in the home office files in a drawer marked personal, which was adjacent to the drawer marked legal, marital. There was also the matter of the Kellner acquisition. In year 2, at a dinner with a group of investors Marcus was trying to cultivate, Nola had mentioned, in the way that information surfaces in conversation when you have been paying the right kind of attention, that a mid-sized logistics firm called Kellner was significantly undervalued because its owner was managing a serious illness and had no succession plan and would be motivated to sell within 18 months at a price reflecting urgency rather than market value. She knew this because she had spoken to the owner's wife at a foundation event and had the kind of conversation that two intelligent women have when they are both present in a room that is not tracking them. Marcus's company acquired Kellner 14 months later for a price the board described as exceptional. The acquisition was attributed to the company's early and diligent market intelligence. Nola had not been in the room when the deal closed. She had not been mentioned in the board presentation. She had read about the acquisition the way everyone else had in the business press. That was year 2. In year 3, she had stopped volunteering information in the same way. Not as a protest. Simply as a recalibration. You adjust your behavior to the feedback your environment provides. There was a third year, and in the third year the recalibration had become so complete that I, meaning the original Nola whose memories I was working from, had stopped experiencing it as loss and had begun experiencing it as the natural condition of the arrangement. This is the specific cruelty of a situation that degrades gradually rather than dramatically. You adjust to each increment, and when you look back you cannot identify the single moment when things became what they now are, and because you cannot identify the moment you cannot hold anyone specifically accountable for it, and because you cannot hold anyone accountable you end up holding the situation itself, which is too diffuse to be useful to hold. The novel had called this coldness because it had not looked at it long enough to call it something more accurate. What it was, more accurately, was exhaustion of a specific kind. Not physical exhaustion. She was not tired in the way of someone who has worked too many hours. She was tired in the way of someone who has been offering something in a specific format for 3 years and has received, consistently, the information that the format is wrong. You stop offering in that format. You find the formats that work. Competence, precision, organization, the specific skills that the situation rewards, and the economy of warmth that it has made clear it does not. You become cold. The cold is not yours originally. It is the shape the situation left behind when it withdrew. I had arrived in year 3, 3 days before Chapter 5, with the prenup gap and the company equity and the revision in Dean Hartwell's expression, and 3 days to start building something that did not route through Marcus's name. I engaged a financial advisor on day 2. Not through any referral chain that connected to Marcus. I found the firm through a professional directory, the specific cold kind of search you do when you need someone good, and you need them to have no prior relationship with the situation you are bringing to them. The advisor's name was Nina. She had 30 minutes available at the end of day 2, and listened to the share transfer question with the attention of someone who has heard this question before and understands what it means when someone asks it through a cold search. The structure you're describing is clean, she said. You can move this without challenge as long as you file before anyone thinks to look at the prenup with fresh eyes. How long does the filing take? 2 business days for the transfer to register. I can have the paperwork ready by end of day. I thanked her and said end of day would be fine. On day 3, the night of the Harrison Foundation Gala, I spent the afternoon reviewing what I knew about every board member who would be in attendance and what I knew about Dean's professional habits specifically. He preferred sparkling water at professional events. He arrived early and positioned himself slightly apart from the main social clusters, which was the social posture of a man who prefers incoming conversations to outgoing ones. He wore the same style of dark suit to every event, which suggested that he had solved the clothing question years ago and did not revisit it. I wore blue. A specific blue, not the blue of someone trying to be noticed, but the blue of someone who has considered what they are communicating and landed on composed rather than invisible. There is a meaningful difference between those two things in a room full of people who read signals for a living. Marcus wore dark gray, his default event suit, the one kept pressed and ready by his assistant for functions that required presence, without novelty. We arrived together, as expected, and separated within 12 minutes, which was our usual rhythm at events. His social obligations and mine had never substantially overlapped, and we had long ago stopped manufacturing overlap for the appearance of togetherness. I found Dean at the drink station early in the evening, slightly apart from the board members' cluster, holding sparkling water, exactly where I had expected to find him. On day 3, the night of the Harrison Foundation Gala, I attended as Marcus's wife. I wore blue. Marcus wore his default event suit, dark gray, the one his assistant kept pressed and available for functions that required presence, without requiring novelty. We arrived together and separated within 12 minutes, which was normal. His social obligations and mine had never overlapped much at these events. I found Dean Hartwell at the drink station early in the evening, slightly apart from the main cluster of board members, holding a glass of sparkling water because he did not drink at professional events. I introduced myself, which was unnecessary. He knew who I was, and asked him a single question about the company's midterm expansion into the Asia-Pacific market. The question was specific. It referenced a regulatory filing from the previous quarter that Marcus's team had characterized as a minor procedural hurdle, and that was, in fact, not minor. I had read about it in Chapter 22 of the novel, when its consequences had become significant enough to require board attention, and had spent 20 minutes before the gala refreshing my understanding of the relevant regulation. Dean looked at me with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to answer honestly. "You've read the Q3 regulatory filing," he said. "I read everything that comes through the household," I said. Marcus leaves his briefing documents on the kitchen counter. It's a small kitchen. He looked at me for a moment longer than he strictly needed to. "The team characterizes it as manageable," he said. "The team characterizes a lot of things as manageable," I said, "until they aren't." He was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Marcus was speaking with a junior employee, a woman with dark hair and a specific quality of calm presence that I recognized from the novel's description of Claire Marsh. She was showing him something on her phone. He was leaning forward slightly. The evening was proceeding exactly as the novel had written it. "We should have coffee sometime," Dean said. "Professionally." "I'd like that," I said. On day 8, we had coffee in a cafe near the financial district that was neutral ground. Not his building, not a place associated with Marcus, a location that communicated professional rather than personal. I arrived 2 minutes early, which is the correct interval for a meeting you initiated. I ordered plain black coffee, which is the order of someone not performing comfort. I brought the document on the Asia-Pacific regulatory question. He brought nothing, which was his way of indicating that he intended to listen first. He was a better listener than most executives I had encountered in 3 years of managing their social calendars. He listened with the specific attention of someone who is hearing information rather than waiting to speak, and the information I had was specific enough to reward that kind of attention. I walked him through the regulatory question in the way you walk someone through something when you have thought about it carefully and have a clear point you are building toward. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone organizing a revised assessment. "The team has characterized this as manageable," he said again. "The team," I said, "has not read the Q3 filing from the regulatory body's perspective. They've read it from the applicant's perspective. Those are different documents." He looked at me. "You've read both." "I read what comes through the household," I said. Marcus leaves things on the counter. He picked up his coffee, set it down. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end of it, he had referred me by email that evening to a colleague at an independent investment firm who was working on a project he thought might interest me given my, as he put it, evident familiarity with the sector. The referral was the kind Dean did not make casually. By Chapter 15, my share transfer had registered, and the joint accounts had been reviewed by Nina and restructured into categories that the divorce would address cleanly. I had a working relationship with the investment firm Dean had introduced me to. I had a legal team engaged through a referral from a colleague of Nina's, a firm that did not appear in Marcus's professional network and that had spent considerable time reviewing the prenup with the fresh eyes my advisor had recommended. The fresh eyes had found what I had known they would find. The board meeting summons arrived by email on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks before Chapter 20. Board agenda: quarterly review, strategic update, miscellaneous business. Nola's attendance requested. No explanation of why. She confirmed her attendance. The morning of the board meeting, she dressed in gray, a specific gray, the color of composure rather than absence, the color of someone who has considered what they are communicating and decided on precision. She arrived at the building at the correct time. She took the elevator to the executive floor. She sat in the seat she had occupied at every board meeting for 3 years, slightly to Marcus's left, 2 positions down, the position that communicated present without crowding. He opened with the quarterly review. He moved through the strategic update. He reached the miscellaneous business heading and paused in the specific way of a man who has rehearsed a transition so many times that the pause has become part of the performance. "I have a personal matter to bring to the board's attention," he said. "Nola and I have decided, after considerable reflection, that our marriage has run its natural course. This is a mutual decision, arrived at with full respect for each other and for everything we've built over 3 years. We believe this is the right direction for both of our futures." He looked at me when he said mutual. I said yes before he finished the word futures. Not loudly. The correct volume for a conference room of that size. Simply, yes. The single word, precisely timed, before the sentence had completed itself, before Marcus had exhaled the final syllable, before the room had finished absorbing the announcement. Let me tell you what yes looks like in a room of 12 people who have just watched someone say it when they were not expected to. It looks like 12 people going very still. It looks like the kind of quiet that falls when the soundtrack changes without warning. Not loud, not dramatic, simply different from the quiet that preceded it. It looks like the specific expression of a man at the head of a conference table who has prepared, meticulously, for the conversation he thought he was about to have, and who is discovering in real time that the conversation he has walked into is a different one. Marcus had prepared for a negotiation. He had told himself he was prepared for a scene, because scenes were what he expected from wives in this situation, and he was prepared to handle a scene with the composed firmness of a man who has made his decision and will not unmake it. He had a follow-up statement ready for the tears or the anger. He had a procedural next step ready for the negotiation. He had legal representation on standby for the contested divorce. He had thought through the optics carefully, the board as witness, the formal setting, the public nature of the announcement, and had concluded that these elements would communicate to Nola the seriousness and finality of his intention and would prevent the kind of extended, private, emotionally complicated dissolution he wanted to avoid. He had not prepared for yes. Not this yes. Not the specific, immediate, entirely composed yes of someone who had been ready. He had prepared for a negotiation. He had told himself he was prepared for a scene, because scenes were what he expected from women in this situation, and he was prepared to handle a scene with the composed firmness of a man who has made his decision and is not going to unmake it. He had not prepared for yes. Not this yes. Not the specific, immediate, entirely untroubled yes of someone who had been ready. The room was quiet in the way of 12 people whose expectation has just failed to match reality. I slid a document across the conference table to Marcus's position. 1 page, prepared by my legal team. The specific assets I was requesting from the joint portfolio, the share package, 3 accounts, the property arrangement. The document was dated 11 days earlier. "I've had my team prepare the initial framework," I said, "in the interest of efficiency." Marcus looked at the document. He looked at me. He looked at the document again. He asked me to leave. I had been on my way out since day 3. The divorce was processed in 6 weeks, which was fast for a divorce of this complexity, and which was fast because one party had prepared for it thoroughly and the other had prepared for a different version of it. Marcus's legal team reviewed the prenup. They found the gap. They reviewed the share transfer. It had been completed 10 days before the board meeting, properly filed and registered, legally sound in every technical sense they were able to identify. They spent 4 days looking for a challenge and did not find one because the transfer was clean and had been structured specifically to be clean, and because the people who had structured it had been given 2 weeks and a very specific brief. The negotiation over the remaining joint assets was completed in a single session. My team came with documentation organized by asset category, each category with the relevant valuation, the applicable prenup provision where one existed, and the proposed allocation. His team had prepared for a negotiation in which the documentation had not already been assembled and in which there would be contested ground to cover over multiple sessions. When the documentation exists and the challenge does not, negotiations tend to resolve in the direction of the person who has the documentation. This is not a legal principle. It is simply an observation about how prepared people tend to do in conversations with people who are less prepared. His lead attorney asked, at one point, whether I had anticipated this process beginning at this time. My attorney replied that she would not be addressing questions about her client's state of mind. The question was not asked again. The settlement was signed 3 weeks after the board meeting. The share transfer was confirmed as valid and completed. The accounts were redistributed. The property arrangement was terminated on the agreed timeline. He did not call after the papers were signed. I did not expect him to. We had been, at the most accurate description, colleagues who had shared a household. Colleagues do not generally call after a clean professional separation. The divorce papers were signed on a Friday. My attorney offered coffee. I accepted and drank it looking out the window at the city doing its ordinary morning business, unmoved by the specific conclusion happening in the office behind me. The attorney noted that she had rarely seen a marital dissolution of this complexity proceed with such limited friction. I thanked her, which she received with the expression of someone who has just been thanked for something they suspect was made easier by information they do not have. What Marcus discovered over the following months was the cost of work that had been invisible while it was being done. The events coordinator, who had taken over Nola's calendar, was competent at events. She was not competent at the Harrison Foundation restructuring, which the Foundation's board had been relying on Nola's continued informal involvement to maintain. She was not competent at the Kellner-style intelligence gathering that came from sustained engagement with the right networks over time, the kind of conversations that happen when you are paying attention at the margins of the rooms Marcus operated in. 3 people were eventually hired to cover what she had been covering alone. None of them covered it as comprehensively. This was not a crisis. It was the steady accumulation of small insufficiencies that reveals, over months rather than days, the shape of what had been present before and is no longer present now. Marcus was a good enough executive to manage it. He managed it. But the management took time and resource that the previous arrangement had not required. Claire and Marcus built something genuine, which the novel had always intended, and which I had read and considered and found unsurprising. He was warmer with her than he had been in the marriage, not because he was a different person, but because their dynamic was organized around something other than operational efficiency, and warmth is easier to sustain when it is not competing for time and attention against a household that needs running. She was good for him in the specific ways the novel had said she would be. Nola did not follow this story closely. She had her own to attend to. The investment project Dean had introduced me to a mid-market infrastructure fund with an Asia-Pacific positioning that I had understood from Chapter 22 of the novel would become significantly more valuable when the regulatory environment clarified in the direction most analysts were not expecting, performed in the second year in the way I had anticipated. The firm Dean had connected me with noticed this. They invited me to consult on a second project. The second project also performed. A partnership offer followed, which I accepted with modifications. The infrastructure fund performed in its second year in the direction Chapter 22 had pointed me toward, and the firm that had introduced it to me found this instructive. They arranged a follow-up meeting. In the follow-up meeting, I answered their questions about my analysis with the specificity of someone who has done serious work rather than made a lucky guess, because the analysis was genuine. Reading 40 chapters of a business novel is not the same as doing sector research, but reading 40 chapters of a business novel and then doing sector research produces something that holds up under scrutiny. They invited me to consult on a second project. The second project also performed. The partnership offer came 6 months after that. Dean joined my advisory board 14 months after the divorce was finalized. He had not needed to. He had his own position, his own standing, his own board. He had asked whether I would be open to the arrangement because, and he said this with the specific directness of a man who has decided to stop being oblique about something, he had concluded that the instinct I had demonstrated was the kind he preferred to remain close to. You knew what you were doing before you started doing it, he said, at the meeting where we agreed on the terms. The Asia-Pacific position. The infrastructure fund. The prenup analysis. He paused. Those were not guesses. No, I said. They weren't. How did you know? I had read ahead, I said. He looked at me for a moment. The expression he wore when he was revising something, the same expression he had worn the first time, at the gala, when I had asked about the regulatory filing. How far ahead? Far enough, I said. He accepted this. He had spent 15 years making himself indispensable to roles rather than to people, and a person who makes themselves indispensable to roles has no need to understand the mechanism behind good information, only to recognize it and position themselves correctly relative to it. He accepted this the way he accepted everything that worked, without requiring an explanation that would not have changed the outcome. He had spent 15 years making himself indispensable to roles rather than people, which meant he had learned to value competence over explanation. The explanation was mine. The competence was what he was here for. My practice was small and specific and organized around the skills I had spent 3 years developing in a role that had not named them as skills. The foundation governance experience. The intelligence gathering that came from sustained attention in the right rooms. The specific financial instinct that comes from 3 years of reviewing briefing documents in a small kitchen while the person who should have been reviewing them left them on the counter. I had a view of the city from my office now, not as a CEO's wife looking out through someone else's floor-to-ceiling windows, but from my own. The view was smaller. The windows were mine. The novel had called me cold. It had deployed the word in Chapter 1, in the first scene where I appeared, in a sentence so brief that most readers would not have registered it as a characterization rather than a description. The CEO's wife, cool and composed. Chapter 6, the other characters finding me difficult to approach. Chapter 12, Marcus's internal observation that Nola had never made him feel the way Claire made him feel, and the novel accepting this, without asking why. It had deployed the word with the ease of a story that needed a shorthand for obstacle and found cold more efficient than complicated. The cold wife. The woman who failed to be warm enough to keep a marriage alive. The character who existed so the female lead's warmth could feel like a discovery rather than an ordinary quality. Cold is a judgment that assumes the person being described had warmth to offer and chose to withhold it. What the novel had not asked, the question that nobody in that story had thought to ask, was where the warmth had gone first. 3 years of work received as infrastructure. 3 years of contribution attributed to logistics. 1 product launch dinner, 6 weeks of preparation, and managed the arrangements. 1 Kellner acquisition, 1 conversation at 1 foundation event, and early and diligent market intelligence. You do not continue offering warmth in a format that is consistently received as background function. You recalibrate. You direct your energy toward the places where it produces results, and you stop directing it toward the places where it disappears into the machinery of someone else's life, without leaving a mark. Cold is what warmth becomes when it runs out of places to go. What the novel had also missed, in its interest in Marcus's emotional journey, was that the cold wife it had written was performing a function the novel depended on without acknowledging. The coldness had to be there so the story worked, so the divorce felt justified, so Claire's warmth felt like an arrival rather than a substitution. The novel needed Nola cold. It had made her cold, across 3 years of written experience, and then it had used the coldness as evidence that the divorce was right. This is the specific closed loop of the obstacle character. The story requires you to be a certain way, makes you that way, and then uses that way of being to confirm that the story was right to treat you as an obstacle. I had read the ending. I had understood that the ending required my absence, and had decided the most useful thing I could do with 19 chapters was build something that did not require Marcus's name to stand. Chapter 20 had arrived on schedule. I had been ready on day 3. The 2 things had simply run in parallel, and when one concluded the other was already well underway. Outside my office window the city was doing what cities do in late afternoon. The light shifting from white to gold, the buildings catching it unevenly, some faces bright, and some in shadow depending entirely on their angle to the sun. Dean was in the conference room down the hall with one of the junior analysts, running a numbers review. My assistant had confirmed the morning's client call was moved to Thursday. The novel had given me 40 chapters to lose in. I had used 19 of them to make sure I didn't